Greetings from Transylvania. We're your hosts from the Dracula crew, and join us on our journey to uncover the blood-curdling nuances of Dracula and the broader Victorian era. Joining me today, we're your hosts. I'm John.
I'm Jack.
This is James Conquo.
And I'm Pranav.
And we'll be sharing our insights into Victorian era technology today. And of course, a big thank you to our sponsors, Blood Industries, the leading blood transfusion company in the world, and Dirt.co. Complete your garden bed today. And finally, Bram's Ham, processing the world 1p at a time. Alright, so what do we know about Victorian era technology? Well, we know that the Victorian era started largely with the Industrial Revolution, and so as a result, we see this large migration of people from the countryside to urban centers or cities, and this is marked by urbanization. And so as a result of this mass migration, scientific discovery and technological prowess exponentially grow. And we see a variety of problems both being solved and arise. So before we get into it, do you have a favorite theory about Dracula or another Victorian novel? Reach out to us on Twitter or Instagram, and we all love a great conspiracy theory. But for now, wherever you're in your car, in the kitchen, or at the desk, strap yourself in for a nightmare-fueled journey back into Bram Stoker's haunted world. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll be covering Victorian-era medical practices and how they affect the events that play out in Dracula. So just a little introduction to these medical practices that arose in the Victorian era. Basically, there was a few main themes, and one was bloodletting. So bloodletting was by far the main solution to any and all ailments in the Victorian era. Whether you had a cold or even had a heart attack, they would bloodlet. And the whole reasoning behind this was that letting out the bad blood from your brain would supposedly heal you or help you recover quickly. And this is largely echoed due to this whole miasma theory, right? And so during the Victorian era, there was this almost this evil substance named miasma, which essentially is just bad air. And they applied this theory to any and all fluids, especially blood, which is why letting out, bad blood per se, was the standard at the time. And so you kind of see this in Dracula, where Dracula's almost sucking out your blood, and in the case of Mina, she's sucking out Dracula's blood. And so we see almost, if Dracula is this impure evil vessel, then Mina's sucking out that blood, then she becomes this impure vessel. She's sucking out this miasma, so to speak. Also, during the Victorian era, doctors became very popular, and it became a social status, right? The aristocracy began to recruit doctors as that kind of their private practitioners, and they became this very obtainable, like high social status on the grand scheme of the social ladder. And we also see this in Dracula, where people like Van Helsing or Dr. Seward are highly regarded, and people don't really question Dr. Helsing at all, even though he's kind of resorting back to almost superstitious practices rather than medical practices. And so we just have essentially one case study within Dracula regarding this whole entire medical field, and it's almost representative of the culmination of just all these practices, and especially, or lack thereof, because I see the Victorian era as kind of this transitory period for medical science, where we're kind of coming out of an era where there's superstition rules king. We're still eating Peruvian bark, right, as a cure to pulmonary disease, but we're also discovering things like the X-ray, and we're creating things like the germ theory, all of which are still prevalent today, and they're still very relevant. And so in this transitory period, we see Van Helsing kind of disregard all germ theory and just inject his own 3 different people's of blood into Lucy without regard to their blood type. And this kind of just mirrors the practices back then, where we just see we don't quite know what level of sanitation we need to get to, but we do know that blood transfusions are necessary. And then just going back into a more modern perspective for Victorian medicine, we see the beginnings of these practices, again, with blood transfusions and the beginning of, germ theory, x-rays, the stethoscope, things like that. Okay, so I was just wondering, what do you guys think? What are some symbols or some instances in Dracula where you would kind of see these medical practices playing out? And more importantly, how do they shape the events that go on in the novel?
Yeah, so I did my TikTok essay on kind of similar topic between kind of the perception of medicine in Victorian era. So I looked at two different instances where Seward is kind of the more scientific approach, where he's good with the blood transfusions and all that. And then I looked at Van Helsing, where he was trying to kind of incorporate both science and tradition and work them together. So I kind of highlighted how Van Helsing was kind of the bridge between the supernatural and the scientific. So I feel like with people like that who kind of bring it all together, and he's really versed in all the different practices, and think that with that background and that combination of everything, he brings it forward into kind of this newer industrial area where there's a lot more scientific innovations and everything. So the perception was kind of iffy at the time, but through kind of mainstreaming it and everything, it became a lot more popular.
It's good insight.
I think one of the most obvious signs of superstition implication in Dracula is when Van Helsing ordered all the cloves of garlic to try and save Lucy's life, and there wasn't specific scientific research to they would say, oh, garlic combats vampirism, because it was kind of it was mainly just superstitious belief, and obviously it worked until Lucy's mother opened all the window, got rid of all the garlic, and then Lucy was on the brink of death again. But that's probably one of the most obvious scenes in which superstition and medical kind of intertwined.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we on one hand we see them using, again, going back to the Peruvian bark. When I was reading that, it threw me off. So because this guy had the case study I was reading, this patient had pulmonary disease, and he told the patient to infuse his red wine with Peruvian bark. First of all, where are you going to get this? And second of all, even if you do get, how is this going to help you? Yeah. And it's kind of interesting to see it kind of mirrored in this homeopathic medicine, mirrored in Dracula. On one hand you have the garlic. What is that going to do? There's no, medical backing behind that. And then also you have a blood transfusion, which there is medical backing behind it, as unsafe as they did it, but it still is some kind of medical procedure, which is cool, again, with that transitory era, where you're kind of combining the more archaic with the modern.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show that, especially with Van Helsing, he's an established doctor. Yeah. He's known for being educated and above his time and a prodigy, and he's relying on cloves of garlic and other superstitious means to ward off vampirism, which I think is a testament to how far we've come from medical procedures in the Victorian era to modern day medicine. So yeah, for sure.
I think I might add, especially when people are in times of stress and medical emergency, finding out that one of your closest friends got bit by this fantastical vampire and is slowly having the life force drained out of them. I think you would obviously turn to some more unorthodox methods of treatment. If you see that the medical treatment isn't working, then you might be more inclined to be more desperate. You might turn to garlic and Peruvian bark. It's hard to it's hard to rationalize what they were thinking in that situation.
All right, so I think that's our segment on medical history. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jack, and we're going to learn a little bit more about communication. Or I'm going to turn it over to Pranav, actually.
Yeah.
I'm going to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, so in a really similar vein to what you were talking about, John, I'm really curious about, say a vampire did exist in our real world right now. What would they be like? What would we know about vampires? How would they integrate into our society? How would they be treated by science? Because I think science is defined by its curiosity. That's the engine that drives, the search for knowledge, the search for new things. And if something like a vampire were to exist in the 21st century, people would be so curious. Scientists would be all over vampires. I'm just really interested to think about like what it would be like, and comparing it to what vampires were like in the Victorian imagination. We take this quote from the book, "The Nosferatu did not die like the bee when he stings once." Describes how vampires are immortal, and like they're definitely very different than human beings. You also see that in literature, vampires evolve with society's fears and society's, the issues that exist in society at the current time. A vampire like we saw in Dracula really wouldn't be that scary nowadays. Just like stay away, and you'd be completely fine, especially with knowledge so available at your fingertips. So I think I want to pose a question that, how do you think vampires would integrate into society today? Would they be just like another person with a slightly different diet, or would they be shunned and kept like locked up in zoos, locked up for studies? How do you guys think they would integrate?
I think it would be a lot harder for a vampire to like obviously like grow and integrate in society, just from the stigmatization of like being a vampire in itself. Like think about how quickly people get shunned on social media for like doing immoral actions. Now imagine if you're a vampire, like your entire identity and way of living will be essentially red flagged in an instant. And vampires, the reason why Dracula was surviving so long in London is because he was basically invisible. Social media doesn't exist. Everything's the internet doesn't exist. The main reason he was able to avoid capture so easily was because of the lack of communication. He was able to travel in boats undetected for half the journeys, how he eluded the crew, and it would just be a lot harder to do that, especially in this day and age, because let's say I have to get to, let's say there's a vampire in Durham, I could be there in 20 minutes. Like whereas if it was back in the day, it would take me at least 4 hours, 5 hours just to walk there, let alone, and there aren't modern like roads and modes of transport like cars. It would be a lot harder for a vampire to prey upon and survive in a modern day.
Yeah, for sure. And adding on to that, the paper that I read, the thesis suggested that vampires just solely exist as a body, like an embodiment of society's fears. Back in the day, with all the blood stuff like STDs, sexuality, these were the new topics that they were talking about, the new fears that people had in their minds. So I find it really difficult to believe that something like a vampire would be able to integrate well in society. And I guess going back to what you're talking about, medical practices, what do you guys think science would have thought about them? Do you think they would be studied, or do you think they would be like just discarded and put to the side?
I think they would be locked up in some kind of government facility, 100%. I also think, but just socially, going back to a social aspect, I do think that there is somewhat the opinion that they would actually be able to integrate into society, I think still holds some water. Just about how much vampire media is being created now. Like imagine the novelty of having an actual vampire. Something like the Vampire Diaries or something like that. These are actual like teenagers and stuff like that. I don't think the novelty factor would wear off in something like this, and so I actually think they might be able to integrate with enough time before granted the government like actually releases them into society. But other than that, I think they'll be locked up like within like containment facility.
And going off of that, I remember we were talking about in class once, it was like, if you read a book, it's like, do you guys get scared from reading like a horror story in a book anymore? So it's like, if we're so familiar with vampires in movies and stuff, like nowadays, like if we do see a vampire, are we going to be scared, or are we going to just kind of embrace it as something normal? So something to think about.
It's definitely really interesting. Like vampires would be so different than what people are used to, and people already have difficulty accepting people that are different than them within the same species, and that's still a problem we see today. So I wonder what like vampirism would have been like racism against vampires if they were to exist in our society. Like I think they would be shunned they wouldn't be, even though they might be like biologically kind of superior, I think they'd still be shunned. I don't think they integrate that well. And that's all I had. So on that note, I'll hand it over to Jack for communication.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to do some talking on the communication technologies in Dracula. And to do so, I specifically want to bring to light the telegraph and the typewriter. So these technologies aren't really like old pieces of equipment. They actually kind of really helped revolutionize the society in their time. And it's kind of similar to how the internet was today, kind of being a really big impact on our lives. So these technologies back then were really new and had really big influence as they were being introduced. So imagine kind of living in a world where the fastest way to get a message across was through horse. So obviously it's gonna take a while, and who knows, like miscommunications and everything. And by developing the telegraph, it's similar to kind of like the phone now, where it's like you could send a message within minutes to anywhere in the world. So that's obviously a really big deal back then. And then when we go look at the telegraph, imagine handwriting everything. And some people had probably bad handwriting, or they just you can imagine that there's probably a lot of mistakes and misinterpretations, and it was probably a mess. So with the introduction of the typewriter, it speeds up this process of writing, and it really clearly gets the messages across. So between the telegraph and the typewriter combined, those really help improve just communication and the ability to move forward in society, especially in this beginning of this industrial era. So I want to bring up a quote that I found from the Smithsonian article, and it reviews the book, The Victorian Internet, The Remarkable Story of the Telegraph in the 19th Century's Online Pioneers. So the quote goes, "In fact, the advent of telegraphic communication in the mid-19th century did more to change society, argues Standage, than the development of today's internet." So this kind of highlights my point from earlier that these revolutions were a lot similar to the internet that it was today, and it might have been even more important because we kind of grew up with the internet and that's something normal to us. But imagine growing up your whole life and then all of a sudden you could send something to someone in, who knows, there's like London to Amsterdam. So a really big change there, and it allows the world to become closer in a new way than before. So now kind of talking about it, how it was used in Dracula. These technologies played a really important role in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and as the importance of these technologies at the time were represented in the book, they also were really highlighted throughout the novel, and the characters used telegraph to send their urgent messages, and they also deal with different threats like from Dracula or so whoever it may be, and then they were able to send these messages across to each other. And I think even it was Mina's journal, she used the typewriter to develop her plans, especially when it was towards the end of the book when Dracula tricked them, and then all the guys kind of gave up, and Mina used the typewriter to write out a plan to figure out where Dracula was. So some quotes from the book that kind of implement these, or is the first one, and it's the use of a telegram, and it goes, telegram from Seward, London, and to Van Helsing in Amsterdam, and it says, "The Count's movement traced. He went to Exeter yesterday and stayed there all night. We'll be back to Carfax tomorrow. Mina's report tomorrow, all well." So this kind of shows where Van Helsing's in Amsterdam and they're in London. They're able to send it to him without an issue. He's able to get it, and all's okay. They can move along according to plan. And the second one is Mina using her typewriter, and she says, "I've written in my diary in shorthand, and that has happened since I closed it last. It is late, and I feel physically weak, so I have used the typewriter, as I felt I could thus secure greater accuracy." So this shows that she was tired, probably had a long day or something. She wasn't able to kind of handwrite or in her shorthand to the best of her ability, so she was able to use the typewriter to get it all effectively on paper and still got her message across before she forgot it. So this really shows how this was kind of a revolutionary technology at the time. And besides these innovations and their benefits, they also kind of represent the widespread theme in the Victorian era and their cultural shift towards this scientific understanding and the industrial progress. And it comes back to this overall theme of the episode, which is science and technology in the Victorian era. So finally, I want to highlight some of these echoes in today's world. Today we're able to hear stories all over the world right on our phones, and the internet, social media, whatever it may be. And we can comment and share these stories without an issue, and it could be from here to someone anywhere in a matter of minutes or seconds. And it seems that this connectivity started with the telegraph and the telegram and typewriter in the Victorian era. And as these modern technologies were becoming more important, they were able to kind of innovate that. So I want to ask you guys a question. So do you think these technologies being highlighted in Dracula helped mainstream the Victorian culture shift and shape today's communication technologies?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, so do you think these technologies being highlighted in Dracula helped mainstream the Victorian era's culture shift, kind of like at the time, and kind of make those more popular because they're in readings and different pieces, and then kind of into today from that innovation there into today's communication technology?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, with this whole transitory period being the Victorian era, we have these things where there are these innovative practices, and they're so close to being what we are right now. Obviously, and that they've so clearly shaped. They clearly shaped where we are right now.
Yeah,
right? Obviously, both like socially, but also in the realm of science and technology. Obviously, with like you said, with the telegram and now the modern internet. I mean, the similarities are too large to ignore. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with back in medical. Back in the medical field as well. I mean, I forgot to mention it before, but I mean, there's quotes littered all throughout the book where you see the general picture. They obviously get this general picture, but they're not quite there yet. Like a quote that I found was, "She will die for sheer want of blood to keep the heart's action as it should be." Right? Yeah. The general idea is there. You need blood to survive, right? But why you need it or how you're gonna get it, not quite there yet. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the communication and telegraphs, right? Yeah. You have all these wired lines, but and it takes like a huge network of infrastructure to get there, right?
To get it all across.
How do we get to the internet? We don't really know yet, but eventually, I mean, you've planted the seeds, right, to get there soon. But
yeah, I think that's great, and I remember just reading up on it, and it's like to be able to get that telegram from across, they had to like lay line in the ocean and throughout all these countries. So they definitely laid that foundation then, and I think through that foundation it was able to kind of blow up into what it is now.
Honestly, I think I would kind of disagree with John. I don't think Dracula really helped mainstream the culture shift. Especially, I think if we remember correctly, Dracula wasn't even a popular book until much after the author died and after he wrote it. So I think the technologies honestly speak for themselves. Like, we do see in the plot, like I won't deny, technologies had very, very important place in the plot. We see how she's able to write better with her typewriter, how the telegram, really allows you to send messages way quicker. That communication can't be denied, but I don't think we really needed Dracula to see that. Technology speaks for itself, And if anything, I think from fictional writing and from fantasy, we can see these ideas that once seemed completely, unknowable. Like, if you read a science fiction book from back in the day, we see concepts like computers, the internet, space travel, all these things that would seem completely fantastical back in the day, but now we have like two of those three things. I think fiction helps push the boundaries of science, and the imagination and creativity that you get from fiction helps honestly spur change with technology. But I don't think Dracula helped mainstream the technology in any way. I mean the technology is phenomenal. Like who would want to use that?
Yeah, I think building off your point, it definitely didn't help mainstream Victorian culture as a whole, but I think it definitely influenced some like particular niches, like especially with like storytelling. Like Dracula is a book written from accounts from different people, so it's not just a story without perspective, or like, oh, James went to do this, and as he did that, here's somebody else's opinion on this. It's accounts written from the perspective of one person throughout the entirety of the story. Even the telegrams from what was the name? The transportation companies. I said, oh, Dracula's boxes have been delivered to the thing. That's like, it's not. It's like it's a perspective that's outside of like the protagonist's like experience of what happens in the book, and that's definitely important to. It's important to take into account when you're thinking of how books have been made since then. So like how that was like an early instance of how these type of communication was used and how it's gone from there. So I think that's important to take apart. But yeah, it didn't help mainstream everything from that point. It was just some issues, I think.
Yeah. There's some great points, and I think that I guess that could be something that's really debated over and over again. So great. So I'm gonna pass it over to James for our final segment.
Anyway, thank you. So my segment, I decided to talk about psychology and psychiatry in the Victorian era. So first we have to understand the mind in the Victorian era, and I think what would help us understand that is understanding what Dracula symbolizes in the book. So Dracula effectively symbolizes corruption and evil of what is already being existing. So for a Victorian like audience, what's some things they value? They value purity in their women. They value obviously aristocracy and knowledge and all these traditional values that they uphold. And Dracula, why he's so dangerous is he comes in and effectively corrupts all that as a means to take down Victorian society. And one of the characters that he does it through, in fact one of the only male characters he does it through, is through Renfield. And the reason why he's able to do it so effectively is because Renfield by himself effectively symbolizes how evil can grow in a character, and how consumerism is used in characters to effectively destroy civilizations and stuff like that. So Renfield's most defining characteristic is probably his ability to consume. So through Dr. Seward's observations of him, he consumes insects, flies. He uses flies to catch spiders to catch birds, and you can see how like he starts small and his capacity for evil grows and grows and grows and grows. And effectively after his especially after his encounters with Dracula, that threshold for evil only grows. So Dracula is aware of his potential to cause damage to the crew through Renfield, so he effectively gives him power and influence to become more capable of like causing chaos and stuff like that. And that's definitely highlighted through how his mood like changes and his aggressive fits change throughout the book. Yeah, so Renfield's like mood and characteristics and his aggressive fits of rage, they change after sunrise. He gets more violent, obviously. And Seward, the way that this relates back to the technology is Dr. Seward is he's not really compassionate towards the treatment of his patients. I think that's definitely like important to take in mind when it compared to a modern audience. Obviously mental health is like, it's treated a lot more seriously, and it's treated a lot more compassionately. We have clinics, we have mental health professions on campuses, we have wellness days, we have all of these implicated like technologies and stuff to ensure that mental health is upheld and not led to corruption. Whereas in a Victorian setting, mental health is definitely shunned upon, because Renfield isn't respected by any member of to the book at all. Like, and he's effectively treated through waistcoats, isolation, and observation, as opposed to rehabilitation. So that definitely speaks difference between a modern approach to mental health and psychology, as opposed to a Victorian view on how psychology is basically just kept in good standing in the Victorian era.
I definitely agree with you. I mean, I remember distinctly one of the quotes when they were introducing Dr. Seward was Lucy describing him, because if you remember, Seward was courting her before she chose someone else, and she basically says like, he's a doctor and really clever, just fancy. He's only 9 and 20, and he has an immense lunatic asylum all under his own care. So I think speaking on psychiatry during the Victorian era, and like, you know, how it kind of relates to like this growing technology is the lunatic asylum. I think something that people often overlooked is it was actually created during that era, and I mean we see it now, even now today, and it's such a like with modern media, it's definitely a pop culture icon, especially with something like I don't know, like Batman, something like that. But we often overlook like its effectiveness, right? So I mean, the asylum has, even in Dracula, it allows, it's like a pivotal point, right? It allows Seward to observe the behaviors of Renfield and Dracula's influence on them, whether he knows it or not at the beginning of the book. Also, something that that's something that relates to technology and science is we see a lot like the official notarization of a lot of like observations and stuff like that written down in. I'm not saying it wasn't written down before, because obviously it's been written down since the beginning of science, but like we see a very strict adherence to this like scientific method, especially when it comes to psychiatry. Again, with Seward's detailed notes and observations, all made possible through the advent of the asylum. Right? So that's just something I found very, very interesting. And also, going back to what I said earlier about doctors being some kind of status symbol now. I mean, you see, Lucy she's marveling at the fact that he has his own his own like asylum, which is pretty interesting, I would say.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something to that. If you see the way the doctors treat their patients in this book, I think it's they dehumanize the patient to such a level. They try to abstract any emotion, any attachment to the patient, which is like really surprising, because I think, especially back then when the science obviously wasn't that great, I feel like the emotional connection you have with the patient is way more important. But they seem very dejected. They don't seem attached to the patient at all. They see them as just objects that need to be fixed and tinkered with. And that's an attitude that's persisted until even very recently. Even now, doctors often dehumanize patients just so they don't have to deal with the emotional attachment that they give with the patient. If they die, they don't want to be sad about it and have it impact their job. They don't want to let their emotions cloud their judgment, even though recent evidence shows that having a good connection with your patient and having a good psych helps patients and helps their treatment get along better, and they do better, actually, as a matter of fact. And I find it really interesting that with the lack of technology and science, they still chose to be they don't effectively work on mental health at all. They just don't do anything.
Yeah, I think to build a pronounced point that really it's really important to like understand that, because they're probably acting that way because they have that lack of knowledge. You know what I mean? They haven't made those advancements yet, which is definitely a glaring difference between Victorian like psychology and technology. And like, for example, like they haven't invented cars yet because they haven't made that advancement yet. They're not aware of it yet. But I think, especially in more moral, like I don't remember any time that Seward would give him medication to actually like help his cause. It was just observation, trying to learn as much as he could about his case, and it's less about, he didn't really have an empathetic approach to Renfield. It was more fascination, and it was more like wanting to understand the human psyche as opposed to helping the patient, which you can understand if it's because they have such limited knowledge about mental health at the time. You can kind of understand why they would be more, they would advocate more to understanding than helping, if that makes sense. So yeah, definitely important.
All right, that was a great discussion. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. I enjoyed learning with you guys about Victorian era technology, medicine, and just science in general. And I hope you guys learned something too. Remember, subscribe to any and all of the Dracula Crew social. We are on Instagram and Twitter. And until next week. Anyways, we're the Dracula Crew, where the shadows of the past meet the light of understanding.